section of the graveyard book. We're going to read another part of chapter 7. Since it's a really long chapter, we're going to read the second part of it, and then next week we'll finish chapter 7 and move on to chapter 8, and we will finish the book there. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time after Scarlett started to remember Bod, because she's now back at the graveyard, and they're both older, so they didn't really remember each other, but she started to remember, so that's where we left off. Okay. Bod had stores of food, the kind that lasted, cached in the crypt, and more in some of the chiller tombs and vaults and mausoleums. Silas had made sure of that. He had enough food to keep him going for a couple of months. Unless Silas or Miss Lepesky was there, he simply would not leave the graveyard. He missed the world beyond the graveyard gates, but he knew it was not safe out there, not yet. The graveyard, though, was his world and his domain, and he was proud of it and loved it as only a 14-year-old boy can love anything. And yet, in the graveyard, no one ever changed. The little children Bod had played with when he was small were still little children. Fortinbras's Bartleby, who had once been his best friend, was now 4 or 5 years younger than Bod was. And they talked less. They had less to talk about each time they saw each other. Thackeray Porringer was Bod's height and age, and seemed to be in much better temper with him. He would walk with Bod in the evenings and tell stories of unfortunate things that had happened to his friends. Normally the stories would end in the friends being hanged until they were dead for no offense of theirs, and by mistake, although sometimes they were simply transported to the American colonies and they didn't have to be hanged unless they came back. Liza Hempstock, who had been Bod's best friend for the last 6 years, was different in another way. She was less likely to be there for him when Bod went down to the nettle patch to see her, and on the rare occasions when she would be short-tempered, argumentative, and often downright rude. Bod talked to Mr. Owens about this, and after a few moments' reflection, his father said, "It's just women, I reckon. She liked you as a boy, probably isn't sure who you are now. You're a young man. I used to play with one little girl down by the duck pond every day until she turned about your age. And then she threw an apple at my head and did not say another word to me until I was 17. Mrs. Owens sniffed. "It was a pear I threw," she said tartly. "And I was talking to you again soon enough, for we danced a measure at your cousin Ned's wedding, and that was but 2 days after your 16th birthday. Mr. Owens said, "Of course you are right, my dear." He winked at Bod to tell him that it was none of it serious. And then he mouthed 17 to show that really it was. Bod had allowed himself no friends among the living. That way, he had realized back during his short-lived school days, lay on trouble. Still, he had remembered Scarlett, had missed her for years after she went away, and long ago faced the fact he would never see her again. And now she had been here in his graveyard, and he had not known her. He was wandering deeper into the tangle of ivy and trees that made the graveyard's northwest quadrant so dangerous. Signs advised visitors to keep out, but the signs were not needed. It was uninviting and creepy once you were past the ivy tangle that marked the end of the Egyptian walk, and the black doors and the mock Egyptian walls that led to the people's final resting places. In the northwest, nature had been reclaiming the graveyard for almost 100 years, and the stones were tipped over, graves were forgotten or simply lost beneath the green ivy and the leaf fall of 50 years. Paths were lost and impassable. Bod walked with care. He knew the area well, and he knew how dangerous it could be. When Bod was 9, he had been exploring in just this part of the world when the soil had given way beneath him, tumbling him into a hole almost 20 feet down. The grave had been dug deep to accommodate many coffins, but there was no headstone and only one coffin down at the bottom, containing a rather excitable medical gentleman named Sarsters, who seemed thrilled by Bod's arrival and insisted on examining Bod's wrist, which Bod had twisted in the tumble, grabbing onto a root, before he could be persuaded to go and fetch help. Bod was making his way through the northwest quadrant, a sludge of fallen leaves, a tangle of ivy, where the foxes made their homes and fallen angels stared up blindly, because he had had an urge to talk to the poet. Nehemiah Trott was the poet's name, and his gravestone beneath the greenery read, "Here lies the mortal remains of Nehemiah Trott, poet, 1741 to 1774. Swans sing before they die." Bod said, "Master Trott, might I ask for your advice?" Nehemiah Trot beamed wanly. Of course, brave boy, the advice of poets is the cordiality of kings. How may I smear unction on your, no, not unction, how may I give balm to your pain? I'm not actually in pain, well, there's a girl I used to know, and I wasn't sure if I should find her and talk to her or if I should just forget about it. Nehemiah Trot drew himself up to his full height, which was less than Bod's, raised both hands to his chest excitedly and said, Oh, you must go to her and implore her. Implore her. You must call her your Terpsichore, your Echo, your Clytemnestra. You must write poems for her, mighty odes. I shall help you write them, and thus, and only thus, shall you win your true love's heart. I don't actually need to win her heart. She's not my true love, said Bod, just someone I'd like to talk to. Of all the organs, said Nehemiah Trot, the tongue is the most remarkable, for we use it both to taste our sweet wine and bitter poison. Thus also do we utter words both sweet and sour with the same tongue. Go to her, talk to her. I shouldn't. You should, sir, you must. I shall write about it when the battle's lost and won. But if I unfade for one person, it makes it easier for other people to see me. Nehemiah Trot said, Ah, listen to me, young Leander, young hero, young Alexander. If you dare nothing, then when the day is over, nothing is all you will have gained. Good point. Bod was pleased with himself, and glad he had thought of asking the poet for advice. Really, he thought, if you couldn't trust a poet to offer sensible advice, who could you trust? Which reminded him. Mr. Trot, said Bod, tell me about revenge. Dish best served cold, said Nehemiah Trot. Do not take revenge in the heat of the moment. Instead, wait until the hour is propitious. There was a Grub Street hack named O'Leary, an Irishman, I should add, who had the nerve, the confounded cheek to write of my first slim volume of poems, a nosegay of beautiful assembled for gentlemen of quality, that it was inferior doggerel of no worth whatsoever, and that the paper it was written on would have been better used as, no, I cannot say. Let us simply agree that it was a most vulgar statement. But you got your revenge on him? Asked Bod, curious. On him and on his entire pestilent breed. Oh, I had my revenge, Master Owens, and it was a terrible one. I wrote and had published a letter which I nailed to the doors of the public houses in London, which were such low scribbling folk were wont to frequent, and I explained that, given the fragility of the genius poetical, I would henceforth write not for them, but only for myself and posterity, and that I should, as long as I lived, publish no more poems for them. Thus I left instructions that upon my death my poems were to be buried with me, unpublished, and that only when posterity realized my genius, realized that hundreds of my verses had been lost, only then was my coffin to be disinterred. Only then could my poems be removed from my cold dead hand, to finally be published to the approbation and delight of all. It is a terrible thing to be ahead of your time. And after you died, they dug you up and they printed the poems? No, not yet, no, but there is still plenty of time. Posterity is vast. So that was your revenge? Indeed, and a mightily powerful and cunning one at that. Yes, said Bod, unconvinced. Best served cold, said Nehemiah Trot proudly. Bod left the northwest of the graveyard, returned through the Egyptian walk to the more orderly paths and untangled ways, and as the dusk fell, he wandered back towards the old chapel, not because he hoped Silas had returned from his travels, but because he had spent his life visiting the chapel at dusk, and it felt good to have a rhythm, and anyway he was hungry. Bod slipped through the crypt door down into the crypt. He moved a cardboard box filled with curled and damp parish papers, and took out a carton of orange juice, an apple, a box of breadsticks, and a block of cheese, and he ate while pondering how and whether he would seek out Scarlet. He would dream walk, perhaps, since that was how she had come to him. He headed outside, was on his way to sit on the gray wooden bench, when he saw something and he hesitated. There was someone already there, sitting on his bench. She was reading a magazine. Bod faded even more, became a part of the graveyard, no more important than a shadow or a twig. But she looked up. She looked straight at him, and she said, "Bod, is that you?" He said nothing. Then he said, "Why can you see me?" I almost couldn't. At first I thought you were a shadow or something, but you looked like you did in my dream. You sort of came into focus. He walked over to the bench. He said, "Can you actually read that? Isn't it too dark for you?" Scarlett closed the magazine. She said, "It's odd. You'd think it would be too dark, but I could read it fine, no problem." "Are you," he trailed off, uncertain of what he had wanted to ask, "are you here on your own?" She nodded. "I helped Mr. Frost do some grave rubbings after school, and then I told him I wanted to sit and think here for a bit. When I'm done, I promised to go and have a cup of tea with him, and he'll run me home. He didn't even ask why, just said he loves sitting in the graveyards too, and that he thinks they can be the most peaceful places in the world." Then she said, "Can I hug you?" "Do you want to?" said Bod. "Yes." "Well then," he thought for a moment, "I don't mind if you do. My hands won't go through you or anything. You're really there?" "You won't go through me," he told her, and she threw her arms around him and squeezed him so tightly he could hardly breathe. He said, "That hurts." Scarlett let go. "Sorry." "No, it was nice. I mean, you just squeezed more than I was expecting. I just wanted to know if you were real. All these years I thought you were just something in my head, and then I forgot about you. But I didn't wake you up, and you're back. You're in my head, and you're in the world too." Bod smiled. He said, "You used to wear a sort of a coat. It was orange, and whenever I saw that particular color orange, I'd think of you. I don't suppose you still have that coat." "No," she said, "not for a long time. It would be a wee bit too small for me now." "Yes," said Bod, "of course." "I should go home," said Scarlett. "I thought I could come up on the weekend, though." And then seeing the expression on Bod's face, she said, "Today's Wednesday." "I'd like that." She turned to go. Then she said, "How will I find you next time?" Bod said, "I'll find you, don't worry. Just be on your own and I'll find you." She nodded and was gone. Bod walked back into the graveyard and up the hill until he reached the Frobisher mausoleum. He did not enter it. He climbed up the side of the building, using the thick ivy root as a foothold, and he pulled himself up onto the stone roof where he sat, looking out at the world of moving things beyond the graveyard, and he remembered the way that Scarlett had held him, and how safe he had felt, if only for a moment, and how fine it would be to walk safely in the lands beyond the graveyard, and how good it was to measure of his own small world, to be the master of his own small world. Scarlett said that she didn't want a cup of tea, thank you, or a chocolate biscuit. Mr. Frost was concerned. "Honestly," he told her, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "Well, a graveyard, not a bad place to see one if you were going to. I had an aunt once who claimed her parrot was haunted. She was a scarlet macaw, the parrot. The aunt was an architect, never knew the details." "I'm fine," said Scarlett. "It was just a long day." "I'll give you a lift home then. Any idea what this says? Been puzzling over it for half an hour." He indicated a grave rubbing on the little table held flat by a jam jar in each corner. "Is that name Gladstone, do you think? Could it be a relative of the Prime Minister? But I can't make out anything else." "Afraid not," said Scarlett, "but I'll take another look when I come out on Saturday." "Is your mother likely to put in an appearance?" "She said she'd drop me off here in the morning. Then she has to go and get groceries for our dinner. She's cooking a roast chicken." "Do you think," asked Mr. Frost hopefully, "there are likely to be roast potatoes?" "I expect so, yes." Mr. Frost looked delighted. Then he said, "I wouldn't want to put her out of her way, I mean." "Oh, she's loving it," said Scarlett truthfully. "Thank you for giving me a lift home." "More than welcome," said Mr. Frost. They walked together down the steps in Mr. Frost's high, narrow house to the little entrance hall at the bottom of the stairs. In Krakow, on Wall Hill, there are caves called the Dragon's Den, named after a long-dead dragon. These are the caves that the tourists know about. These are caves beneath those caves that the tourists do not know and do never ever get to visit. They go down a long way, and they are inhabited. Silas went first, followed by the gray hugeness of Miss Lepescu, padding quietly on 4 feet just behind him. Behind them was Kandar, a bandage-wrapped Assyrian mummy with powerful eagle wings and eyes like rubies, who was carrying a small pig. There had originally been 4 of them, but they had lost Harun in a cave far above when the Ifrit, as naturally overconfident as are all of its race, had stepped into a space bounded by 3 polished bronze mirrors and had been swallowed up in a blaze of bronze light. In moments, the Ifrit could only be seen in the mirrors and no longer in reality. In the mirrors, his fiery eyes were wide open and his mouth was moving as if he was shouting at them to leave and beware, and then he faded and was lost to them. Silas, who had no problems with mirrors, had uncovered one of them with his coat, rendering the trap useless. "So," said Silas, "now there are only 3 of us." "And a pig," said Candor. "Why?" asked Miss Lepescu with a wolf tongue through wolf teeth. "Why the pig?" "It's lucky," said Candor. Miss Lepescu growled, unconvinced. "Did Haroun have a pig?" asked Candor simply. "Hush," said Silas. "They are coming, from the sound of it. There are many of them." "Let them come," whispered Candor. Miss Lepescu's hackles were rising. She said nothing, but she was ready for them, and it was only by an effort of will that she did not throw her head and howl. Okay, so we're going to stop there. I think that's a good place to stop for today. So we'll come back next week and finish up the entire book. We have quite a bit left, so it might take us a little while to finish it. Next week it'll probably be a longer video, but I think it's a good place to stop there, and we'll find out what Silas and Miss Lepescu and all of them have got going on. So we'll see you next week.